welcome to this Dementia Researcher Salon. We're just going to let a few more people join before we get started.
We should have worn. Do you have a Dementia Researcher Salon t-shirt?
I do, but I've left it at home today.
Same here.
That's true, Anna. I've completely forgot about that.
I always get to this point and think, oh, I should have worn my t-shirt.
Great point. Next time I will remember.
Me too.
Okay, great. I can see that we have some participants in the salon. So I'm going to get started, and this will then also be on the salon or the Dementia Researcher website so that people can watch back, which I know a lot of people do. So welcome to this session, which is on the practicalities of overseas lab visits. My name is Dr Cliona Farrell, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at UCL. And I think this is a really exciting topic and something that really excites people. But I think it sounds great to set up these research visits, but there's a huge number of practical things that go with moving overseas for a short or for a long time that I think need to be addressed. And it's a good time to give some tips about that. Today, joining me are two fantastic speakers. So firstly, we have Dr Cassandra Dinius from University College Dublin, who has moved between the US and Ireland in her career and brings direct experience of planning and managing international relocations. And then also joining us today is Dr Anna Volkmer, who is a senior NIHR research fellow from University College London, who has successfully navigated multiple NIHR funding pathways and knows what it takes to plan productive overseas visits, having crossed to both the US and Australia to visit other groups. So we've got very worldwide experience from today. And then myself, I'm also no stranger to this. Last year, I went to California, to the US, to do a research visit as well. So I'm able to add in something when we come to the Q&A at the end. So as some of you will know from this format, we start with two short presentations from our speakers. And then we'll have some chance to ask questions through the chat, and then I can pose these to the speakers, and we'll have a general discussion about the topic as well. So I think we'll hear from both of you for 10 to 15 minutes. And today we're going to start with Cassandra. So Cassandra, do you want to share your slides and we can hand it over to you?
Thanks so much, Cliona. Yeah, let me get that pulled up. Oh. Is that working okay?
Yeah, it looks great. And I'll mute myself and go off video so that you have center stage.
Sounds good. So yeah, thanks very much for the opportunity to share a bit of my experience with you. I will be talking a little bit about moving abroad for my postdoc. And then during my postdoc, I also did an overseas lab visit to France to visit a lab for a bit of their specialization in fMRI analysis. So I'll be drawing on a few experiences as I talk about things here today. So if you're anything like me and you are picturing the day of graduation, I had a lot of ideas of what this would feel like. And I was very focused on being able to cross the stage and that sense of achievement that would come with getting my PhD. And I ended up graduating in May of 2020. So it was right in the middle of the pandemic. And quite quickly, I would say that the expectations I had around what that day would look like and what the job market would look like, I've had to be quite flexible. So I'll talk to that a little bit as well as we go through. So I am originally from the West Coast of the United States and grew up in Washington and Oregon. and I moved quite far away just for my PhD. So I'll be drawing a bit on that experience because, again, this was a move where I was trying to decide, does this fit with my research goals? How does this fit with my life goals? And also, what is the culture of the lab that I'm going to? And can I really see myself living there and staying there for a bit? And then I moved even further afield for my postdoc. And as Cliona said, I'm now in Ireland. And you'll see by the end of the short talk that I am now very happy in Ireland. So I don't know if I'll be going back to the States. So just in that, I suppose, in the spirit of being open to whatever might present itself as opportunities. Coming here for a postdoc has led to a second postdoc, has led to now the post I'm in. So yeah. So when it comes to practicalities, I suppose one of the things I heard during my undergrad was the weather is the same in every library. And I guess the notion there was kind of people saying, oh, I might want to go to a different lab, or I might want to go to a different university to have greater research experience, and just recognizing that a lot of the time that you spend is going to be indoors and doing the work. Now, I will say with balance that there are opportunities to be able to see the countries and the places that you might be visiting. And I would really recommend making the most of that, but also balancing it with your research goals. So considering, why are you thinking about overseas? Are there opportunities, or are there skills that you might be able to develop and experience that you wouldn't have where you are? And also, are there life experiences that you might have? So for me, the opportunity to live in Europe has afforded me many opportunities to travel and to visit cultures I wouldn't have otherwise been able to visit. So it's been both beneficial for my career, but also for me as an individual. So talking about the practicalities of what it looks like, a few things before you make the move and when you're thinking about, okay, I'm going to go visit. When I was in France, I was there for just a few months. I've been in Dublin now for 3.5 years. I moved for my PhD. That ended up being a 4-year move. So in advance of this, recognizing that it might be short term, it might be longer term, and thinking, what does getting to know your potential temporary or permanent new home look like? So first, the practicalities of filling out the applications, and that can be challenging if you're working across languages, if you're working across time zones. So making sure to provide yourself plenty of time in advance of when those deadlines might be. And the same for interviews. So when I interviewed for my PhD, I was able to fly there. I was really fortunate that I had the funding to be able to do that and visit in person. Whereas when I interviewed for my postdoc, which would be 8-hour time difference from where I was at the time, it was during COVID. So I wasn't able to visit in person. This was purely a Zoom interview. During my lab visit to France, I already knew the PI because we had worked together. So in that regard, it was a bit more about what will be the goals of that visit rather than a formal interview process. I will say that during that interview, because the idea of uprooting yourself and moving, again, either for a short or a long period of time, because that is such a consequential thing in your life, I think it's really important to have open dialogue as much as possible during that interview and during that kind of fact-finding process. So for me, I would recommend that you try to chat not only with the PI, but maybe also with other students or postdocs that are within that lab to get a feel for what day-to-day might look like. You'll also have to consider funding. Now, this probably goes without saying, but cost of living is different in different places. And so when you're considering what your paycheck will look like, trying to figure out how far that'll go, and considering, how might your life look different, and your expenses might look different beyond just a cost of living. For example, being in Europe, I travel more. And so factoring in those type of lifestyle changes as well. Then there's, of course, the part about visas and work permits, making sure that you are able to undertake work legally, and what that process can look like. I would say, again, here, just time, giving yourself plenty of time is important. For me, in my move from the US to Ireland, this was about a 6-month process, from August until I actually moved in January. So again, just giving yourself time to navigate what that work permit process might look like. And then accommodation. Where will you be living? And being sure, yes, maybe you can make it work in a 1-bedroom apartment, but where are you going to be doing your, if you're work from home, or if you have a home office, where will you have access to be able to kind of get yourself away from work when you also need time to rest? So thinking about, what does the living situation look like? What is the housing market like? And this can be really tricky if you're on a short-term visit. So for example, for my lab visit in France, like I said, that was about 2 months, and I lived in a hotel, which wasn't ideal. So it's trying to figure out, okay, if I'm in this hotel, are there places that I can get out and work a bit that's not in the office? Am I okay not being able to cook for that whole period of time? What does that look like? So really thinking through your day-to-day. Oftentimes, I think we can be so excited by the opportunity of research that we can kind of overlook what it's actually going to be like living there as well. And then in the process of actually living and working overseas, there's a few things that I would point out here. First, around being able to facilitate communication with your supports back home, maintaining friendships, maintaining work relationships as well. So I'm on an 8-hour time difference from my family, and a 5-hour time difference from my best friend. So what are ways that I can be really intentional in keeping those relationships active, and making sure that I'm nurturing those relationships, because those are important and conducive to me doing good work as well, because I need to be a functioning human in addition to being a good researcher. And while you're overseas, using this as an opportunity to network. And there was somebody here in Ireland who gave me a great perspective on networking. Coming from America, I often felt networking could be quite transactional. It felt a bit phony to me, a little bit fake. It was kind of, oh, what might be able to, I could provide for you that you could provide for me? What can we get out of each other? And I never liked that feeling. I wouldn't have considered myself a strong networker because it felt uncomfortable. And when I moved to Ireland, networking is a huge part of the day-to-day, and it doesn't have that transactional feeling. It's much more about, how can we collaborate? Maybe I know somebody that's doing work you might be interested in, or maybe I know somebody who knows some stuff that you don't know that maybe you'd be curious about. So there's kind of this different view of networking. And the take home that I had heard from somebody was to view networking like a neural network, in that your brain has many networks and they all coexist, and it's actually about just making the whole thing work. It's not about transactions. And I liked that perspective on networking. There's also, of course, cultural differences. I've had cultural differences within my own country, moving from the West Coast to the Midwest. There were differences there. But of course, greater differences, I would say, between different countries. So the work balance in France was a bit of a cultural difference for me, in that I remember taking a longer lunch and being able to come into the office a little bit later than I was used to. And then cultural differences in Ireland would even be things like I was talking about around networking. But also the first time that my PI said, oh, I'm going out for drinks with some of the other PIs, you should come. And as an American, I was like, I'm not going to go out for drinks with my boss. That's really uncomfortable. And then recognizing that's a cultural difference, and actually a lot of work goes on during these conversations. So learning to embrace those cultural differences, being able to chat to other people and kind of say, okay, and sometimes I'll say, I'm too American to understand this. Can somebody help? And I've always had good results with that. And then finally, thinking about how to translate the experience you're having overseas for back home. And Anna might talk more about this in the next talk. But for me, I have not gone back to the States yet, so I haven't had to do this piece. But in the back of my head, I'm often thinking, okay, the experiences I've had, how would I write about this in my home culture? Or how would the work I'm doing be relevant to what's going on back home? So my current role is in public and patient involvement, or what's called PPI, which would be quite well known within Ireland and the UK, but wouldn't be as well known in America. So just thinking about how would I frame the work that I'm doing, the skills that I've gained, how would I be able to translate that back? So if I did move back to the States, how would I be able to describe what it is that I've gained it back in my home culture? And then I guess to wrap things up, I just wanted to say I came over for a postdoc, which then turned into I was visiting staff for a bit, and then another postdoc, and now I've taken on a long-term role. So although I came over just for the one experience, I've gotten sucked in, and it's been a lovely experience. And so I would recommend also that you stay open to what might come from that experience. It's been both beneficial for me when it comes to work, but also in a personal regard as well. I've had a lot of growth. And so for me, this has been a really positive experience, and it's provided opportunities I wouldn't have otherwise had. And so while you might think this is a short-term thing, remaining open to seeing what opportunities might exist on a larger scale. That's me. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Cassandra. That was a really nice overview of your experiences, and I think some really good take-home messages in there. I really like the comparisons you make between kind of the culture in the various places that you've been, and I think that message about networking not having to be transactional is really important. So yeah, thank you for that. And I have so many questions, but I will save them for the end after Anna has spoken as well.
Cheers.
So I will also introduce Dr. Anna Volkmer, who will now give her experience from doing research visits across the globe, really. So I'm going to share my screen because I have Anna's slides. Anna, are you still on the call? Can't see.
I don't see her on my end. Sorry to jump in there. But yeah.
Okay, well, let's see if Anna can rejoin, and I'll keep an eye on my inbox in case she's trying to rejoin. But yeah, I'm going to ask you, Cassandra, some questions because I think it's a great experience. Oh, she's back.
Anna's back. Okay,
Yay,
I'll be on hold here. Yeah.
Super. Sorry.
No, you just kept us hanging for a second. I think that's a really nice way to introduce yourself. Like, ooh.
Yeah, exactly. All the techie issues, but we'll get there in the end. You can't have like a webinar or an event without tech issues, can you?
Not at all. Okay, I'm going to share your screen now, Anna.
Thank you. That's brilliant. I think my talk will nicely complement what Cassandra said, actually. So I have given myself an extra little title, which is Digital Migrant Overseas Lab Visits, because there were lots of articles in the paper there's been a couple of articles in the paper over the last few weeks about people moving overseas and working remotely. And I really identified with some of them. And the articles, some of them were saying how easy it is. And I have to say, a lot of it is really easy. Like, as Cassandra was saying, you just have to adapt to different time zones but it's feasible, which is quite phenomenal. I remember as a child, my parents were both journalists, and we used to go overseas. And although they could work from home in the UK, they just couldn't work overseas. And it was a great source of frustration for them. Whereas nowadays, we can work from anywhere. And I'm actually overseas at the moment over in Spain, which is really rather lovely. So if we move on to the next slide, I will also prequel my talk today by saying that I had quite a long life pre-academia. So I'm a clinical speech and language therapist, and I graduated as a speech and language therapist in London. So I was born in London, I grew up in London, I went to university in London and trained as a speech therapist, worked clinically in London. I'm so London-centric and London-biased, but I really wanted to go overseas, even before I came into academia, and actually work overseas. So I worked for 15 years clinically, but 5 of those years I worked overseas in Australia. So I worked in Melbourne as a speech and language therapist. So I wasn't going to focus on that so much, but I would say it has many similarities to what Cassandra said. And insofar as I only intended to work overseas for 1 year, ended up staying for 5. Things kind of turn out differently than you often expect. And it was just the most fantastic experience. And the only reason that I decided to come back to the UK when I was working clinically in Australia was it was just so far away from home. It was often a 13-hour time difference when I was contacting my family over in the UK and friends. We were often in completely the opposite season. You know, we had hot summer, hot Christmases and cold, what Europe would call summer. So often there was this kind of, it was a bit of a disconnect from family. And I think that was really hard. So that, for example, when things went wrong at home, say family was sick or my grandma died, it was really difficult from an emotional perspective to be so far away. So whilst there were loads of easy things, I could slot in beautifully. It was an English-speaking country. I had a desired skill. I actually now have, having done that in my 20s, I'm now, I lived there for so long, I now have dual citizenship. So I have a Australian passport, which makes it really easy for me to go back and forth to Australia quite a lot. So that's a kind of personal perspective on working overseas. But I came to academia, and this is perhaps partly what inspired me. When I was working in Australia, I was working clinically in one of the big hospitals in Melbourne, and I see people, adults, to support them in communication difficulties. And we started getting referrals for people with dementia. And that was quite unusual in the kind of early 2000s, mid 2000s. We didn't do much of that work in speech and language therapy clinically. And I kind of was seeing these people and saying, well, there's lots we can offer, but there's no research evidence. I came back to the UK for personal reasons, but actually when I came back to the UK, I thought, oh, you know, London's the centre of the world. They'll be doing everything in London. And again, clinically, they weren't. And I was getting more and more frustrated. And the lack of research evidence was limiting our ability to fund clinical services. And that's what inspired me to become an academic. So I became a research academic. I did my PhD, part-time funded by the NIHR. And so then I actually ended up doing 2 more lab-based visits in my late 30s and early 40s, just about. So that's the kind of context. So if you move on to the next slide, I applied for an NIHR doctoral research fellowship for my PhD. And many of you will know that the NIHR in the UK are very keen on funding clinicians, which is why it was so suitable for me. So they matched my wage and my pension contributions, which became so much more important the older I got. But when I was putting together one of my first PhD grant fellowship, lots of people advised me to build in funding for an overseas lab visit. And as I think Cliona said right at the beginning, super exciting. I was like, gosh, no one would pay for this in my clinical life, especially not the NHS. And can you imagine? I'm going to go to Chicago for 6 weeks. It's going to be fantastic. And so I incorporated that funding in. I had to get provisional agreement though. So even when I was doing my grant funding application, there was no guarantee I would get this, but I had to email the place I was planning to go to for them to say in principle, yes. Similarly, when I then went, so I graduated the same year as Cassandra in 2020, right at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. And then I applied for an NIHR advanced fellowship. And similarly, I built in another lab visit, actually overseas again, back to the States, to Texas this time. And again, I popped it in for a 6-week period. But both of these proposals were made 2 years essentially before. So I was in contact with these people almost more than 2 years before I actually went. It felt like kind of quite a disconnect, saying, I want, in 2 years' time, can I come and see you for 6 weeks? There was lots of advanced planning that had to be done. So, but it worked. Luckily I got these grants, these fellowships funded, and I understand that the NIH are really keen on you incorporating these types of lab visits into your proposals, because it really demonstrates everything we're talking about. The fact that you're willing to go overseas, connect, is really valuable to our grant funders, because they want to build researchers who do have international connections. However, if you move on to the next slide, you'll find that one of the biggest issues, the reason I mentioned my age, is because I now have kids. So this is not only something that had to work for me, it had to work for everybody else. And it was I found it really interesting that when I actually got this funding and started telling people I'm going to do an overseas lab visit, people were absolutely horrified. They said, but you can't leave your children. How awful. I did leave my children, but I left them for a much shorter time. And this is where I'm going to, lay myself bare and say that I actually felt it was really important from a parenting point of view, as well as from my occupational point of view, that I showed my family that it was as important for me to be making, for me and my career and what I do, and set a good example as a female in academia, a working female. And I have read some articles that say, if you show your children that if you work in this way and do all the things that your male counterparts might do, that they will respect women in the workplace equally to men. So I have a personal agenda. It's a very personal agenda that I should do this. So let's move on to the next slide. What I would say, though, is I didn't go for 6 weeks. I went for 2 to 3 weeks. So that was a very practical thing. I proposed 6, but in reality, with the children, it wasn't going to work for such a long period of time. And I had to really plan that time far in advance, not just from the perspective of the labs, but also from my family's perspective. And I had to prepare them and the schools. So one top tip, I know we have many listeners in the UK context, and in England, some schools will fine you for taking your children out of school. But for one of my trips abroad, we actually were able to, by showing the invitation and the emails that I had, I was able to show that my children could come with me for part of that trip and take the schools out. So I evidenced my how important my trip overseas was. And even the trips where I didn't take the children with me, actually telling the teachers and telling the school was really valuable, because then they knew the context for when, if my children were finding it difficult. So that's the family stuff. It was hard, but I had a really good time. I highly recommend it. So if you move on to the next slide, I would say the first trip overseas was the hardest. My children were the youngest, but I really immersed myself. And one of the things, was during just in the first, I think it was within a year of starting my PhD. And at the time, this was 2016, and I went to Chicago, and writing blogs and having Twitter accounts was still quite a novelty. And I wrote a blog throughout my entire PhD, where I documented something from every element of my PhD. So I wrote several blogs about being overseas. In the end, my blog was nominated and shortlisted for an NIHR Digital Award. And these were the kind of things I put on there. I put on things about being overseas, being a researcher overseas. And I also, and I guess one of the things I would say is I made the most of it. So it wasn't just a research trip. It was also a personal trip. So I made sure I went running, I went touristing, I made it an opportunity to treat myself, because it was something that was really quite difficult to do, is to tear yourself away from home and go overseas. So it felt like if I had an agenda to disseminate, because that was something I could do in the first year of my PhD. I wasn't really writing papers at that point, but I could disseminate in other ways. That was really valuable. So if you move on to the next slide, I've mentioned learning to love it. This is my Texas trip. I found the Texas trip, actually both the trips, quite interesting from a cultural perspective. When I went to Chicago, somebody once asked me if I knew what pizza was. And if I knew what pizza was, did I know that having pineapple on pizza was a thing? And I had to really restrain myself from saying, Italy is closer to London than you are. But I didn't say that. And then when I went to Texas, it was even more interesting culturally. For example, somebody once said to me, oh, you sound like you're from Downton Abbey, but not over the stairs, under the stairs, which was highly, very amusing. And sometimes people didn't understand me, which I found quite amazing. I had to really enunciate clearly. I once asked for water. I think I must have asked for water rather than water, or even water. But it was a really interesting trip. But I really leaned into it. I had a wonderful opportunity to visit the Parliament building in Texas. I ate lots of amazing food. I went to visit my girlfriend who lives in LA. One of the colleagues at Texas took me on in and around the football, American football, not English football. And you can see that over on the far side, we went kayaking in Texas on the beautiful lake there. And that's actually my research mentor who supported me, who I was visiting, Dr. Maya Henry. And I think I found it's so interesting what Cassandra mentioned about networking, but I found both of these opportunities to be great networking event opportunities, but actually ways of making friends. So it wasn't transactional, because I wasn't just ringing them up for a 1 hour Zoom to focus on something. We had all this time in between to do this stuff, to talk about donuts, to go kayaking, to share experiences. And that made for a much closer bond. And Maya actually is now one of my key mentors on my advanced fellowship. We're if we move on to a couple more slides, I can tell you all about so much more of the work we've done together. You see her again there. I actually combined this visit to Texas with a conference, and I highly recommend that. So I ended up staying in the States on this second occasion for 3.5 weeks. And I went to this very big, important speech therapy conference, or speech therapy researcher conference, called the Clinical Aphasiology Conference, which is quite interestingly, I haven't really seen this anywhere else in the world, but it's quite, you can only present at the conference. It's very exclusive. That's the word I'm looking for. And Maya was actually one of the organizers that year, and she invited me to this exclusive conference. So now I have that on my CV, and that felt like quite an impact factor that I could present at this conference. Since then, if you move on to the next slide. And I should say, this is just the wider idea. Like going to the conference as well with all of Maya's team was a way of even immersing myself in that team even more. So, for example, I roomed with one of the other researchers in Maya's team, which made it, because it was cheaper for them and cheaper for me. There was a researcher from Spain there who I now know quite well as well. So I networked with their networks. So it was a really, really wonderful way and I would say all these people are now, or most of these people are now people that I would call friends. And I have to say, I think that's the key. I was talking to somebody recently. It was one of our managers, and the manager was saying that people find it really, really hard to network. And network is a key component of getting a promotion, right? So it's part of what we need to do. We need to build networks. We need to collaborate. And they were saying that they had been talking to colleagues, and the colleagues are saying they don't know how to network. And I think these overseas lab visits are one very concrete methodology to allow you and enable you to network without even having to, you know, you do have to put yourself out there, but by doing the overseas visit, you have to network because you have to be with people. Whereas I think regular networking at regular conferences is perhaps feels a bit faker because you're just kind of having to meet somebody in a massive room. Whereas in this context, I had lots of individual opportunities to sit down next to someone in their workspace and meet them. And this has led to, if you go on to my next slide, quite a few collaborations. So for example, I've got a couple up here, but practical neurology, that top paper was something I wrote just after a couple of years after my 2016 visit to Northwestern University. And I'd already started making connections with Maya, who I then visited in Texas. And you can see that Maya is a co-author on my core outcomes set work that I've been doing. And I have to say, both of these pieces of work, in fact, the practical neurology paper is one of my most cited papers. And I think that's partly because of that networking that I did that then brought together people from across, we ended up with people from across 4 different countries, across different disciplines of neurology, neuropsychology, and speech and language therapy. So it's just a really great way of bringing people together. The other thing I wanted to mention here is I'm now co-organising a conference, the first ever international conference on primary progressive aphasia, language-led dementia. And I'm co-organising this with Maya Henry, who I visited in Texas. And I think building these relationships is not just about networking, it's about trust. And sometimes trust, you build trust by spending time with people doing non-work related. I know that sounds silly, but it is totally true. You build these trusting relationships as they get to know you as a person. And this is a super exciting opportunity that I couldn't have done on my own. So I've got 4 top tips and then I'm going to finish. So I would say my top tips are build overseas visits into fellowships wherever possible and visit places that are interesting on all counts. I've been to Australia I didn't actually go in. I have also visited Australia a couple of times on research visits, but I haven't incorporated those because for me, that was more like going home because I've been there and I've lived there for so many years. So going to the States felt much scarier to me. I'd never been there and I was interested. So do choose places that you're interested in personally as well as professionally and combine it with other things. I think that's, don't just think that you're going to go there and just be. Think about the things that you could do there. Like, as Cassandra said, set specific goals. There might be things you could combine it with, like conferences or writing, and invest in your relationships. Invest in them. They do pay good dividends. They are worth investing in. And in fact, I hate saying this, but I have been promoted this year. And one of the key bits of feedback on my promotion, so I'm now an associate professor, was the feedback was that I had really good networks, really strong networks. And I would say that's probably my best skill is networking. I'm not the most brilliant scientist, but I've realized that this is a little bit of a superpower, and it's not really, there's no secrets. It's just about doing these kind of things, going and talking to people, investing in relationships, building up friendships and influencing people. So thank you very much for listening. And I think the last slide is the generic slide to remind you all about these salons before we go into a Q&A, I think. Is that right?
Yes. Okay. I just couldn't see you guys, so I was making sure I was unmuted before I started speaking. And thank you so much, Anna. That was really fantastic and such complimentary talks as well. I think there's so much different material covered, which I really enjoyed. And yeah, for myself, I'm now thinking about how can I do more of these research visits. So I have some questions, but I'm also able to monitor the chat. So if any of the participants watching want to put questions or more specific questions in the chat, please do that, and I will read them out to our speakers. But I have a few to get started with. My notes are chaotic as always, so let me have a look at what's probably the best thing to start. So Anna kind of talked about this in the context of networking, and then you showed your research outputs that you got from these collaborative visits as well. But I guess one of my questions is, do you think that before you go on these research visits, do you need to have a planned output? So for example, does it have to be, you know, I'm missing this figure in my paper, I want to go to that? Or do you think it can be broader than that?
Should I go first? Yeah, I would say it's really good to have some specific goals, as Cassandra said. I think it's really vital, actually, broader goals, but I don't think you need to have a specific output in mind. Some of those evolve organically over time. So I guess, I think Cassandra used the word, you've got to be open, or use that phrase. And I think that's probably, it's a bit of both. So I think I've had people come and visit me, and it's really hard when they don't have a goal and you're like, why are you here? And so it's really valuable as a person receiving a visit to say, oh, what can I help? So, you know, so they know what they can help you with and what your expectations are. But equally, if you then get on with them really well and you get offered opportunities or you build new ideas, you've got to be open to new things too.
Yeah, I would just absolutely support everything you said there, Anna. That was really eloquent. I think it's just having a bit of structure on it, and then you can be flexible within that structure. But, you know, at least you've got something to come in and sort of say, okay, here's where I'm headed. And then who knows what might happen, and just being like, you know, open to how it might evolve or what things might come up. Like maybe you're out kayaking and you have a great chat and all of a sudden, oh, that's a new idea, you know? So having that balance, I think, between both would be important. I
agree. I think that's those opportunities where the new ideas get born, aren't they? Yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah. And I suppose it depends on the type of work you're doing. So if you're going to be doing like heavy experimental work, obviously the plan needs to be in place. And usually, you know, you've come up with a hypothesis you're going to test for a reason. Or if you need to meet with patients or participants, that obviously has to be scheduled. But I think, yeah, knowing that there's this kind of wiggle room to create new ideas while you're there is really good. Okay, I'm going to ask one more question before I come to him. Matthew has a question in the chat, and this is more maybe practical. So I was thinking about, so Anna, you mentioned that you specifically wrote into fellowship applications to get funding for this type of visit, but maybe Cassandra, you could comment on where you kind of found funding, maybe for that visit to France specifically, because I think sometimes that's a hidden thing that we don't really know about.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a small pot of funds available for these type of lab visits between Ireland and France specifically. And so the PI on my postdoc, we knew that we wanted to incorporate some work around fMRI for the project. But believe it or not, the university we're at doesn't have a machine. So it required collaboration. And we were able to use then the fMRI at Trinity College. But because we didn't have that machine in-house at our university, it also meant we didn't have people to do the analysis. And so we were able then to work with our partners in France. And because we had that bit of funding, through a different scheme, then we were able to go over and visit and be able to learn from our colleagues there and bring that skill set back and then be able to analyze our data.
Brilliant. And I think there's some similar schemes, so they can be like governmental or university specific. So when I went to California, there's a UCL scheme called the Vogue Fellowship that allows visits to the US. But I think Adam in the notes has written me a few examples. I'm going to read them out before I forget, if I can find them. Oh yeah, so the Marie Claude Curie scheme is a really good one within Europe. And that can be anything from like bigger fellowships that you're writing to go to a postdoc somewhere that you have to move. And I think they also offer smaller ones. And then I think the EMBO in the neuroscience field also have some fellowship opportunities. So if you're a member of any society or working closely in a specific field, do keep looking for those opportunities, because sometimes these schemes are often under applied to as well, because they're difficult to find. So I think that's just something to mention.
There is also, there's also, no, I'm just thinking, there's also another scheme that's been, I know several people have been successful with, and it's the name of a British Prime Minister who's the Prime Minister who won the war? Churchill Fellowships. That's the one. Sorry.
Okay. I felt like really worried about my British knowledge there. So
it's the cigar symbol, isn't it? The Churchill Fellowships. They're specifically for overseas visits, and I know quite a few people have been successful for those across lots of different contexts.
That's brilliant. Thank you for that one. I'm writing that down myself. And then Matthew has asked in the chat, Anna, specifically to you, about getting this first visit during your doctoral fellowship and how you wrote that into the application. What were the goals and objectives?
That's a good question. So so in the area the field of dementia that I work in is called primary progressive aphasia, the language-led dementia. So I wrote into my application that I needed to visit a centre of excellence in relation to diagnosis and care for people with research around diagnosis and care for people with primary progressive aphasia. And the person who basically invented primary progressive aphasia is a neurologist called Marcel Meslem, and he has a research centre at Northwestern University. So I justified it based on I needed to visit a centre of excellence to understand how they do the research, practice as a team, and make connections, and that I would then bring that back to the UK. And so that was probably the key element that I was trying to convey. And I had to put somewhere that I hadn't been. So there is a centre in Sydney, but I've lived in Australia. So you had to kind of justify where you were going as a place that was different to anywhere you'd experienced. And actually I guess the other thing to say is I work in quite an applied area. So it was also, I think I also wrote in something about learning about different health models of healthcare across the world and how people with progressive disease are treated and cared for in that kind of framework.
Yeah, I think that's really useful as well, like to not forget the benefits of these visits, and that those benefits can be written in as goals when you're applying for funding. Exactly. So seeing how research works in a different environment is actually really important for making a good researcher. So it doesn't just have to be scientific objectives.
No, exactly. Especially in the field of dementia, where ultimately we want everything to be applied. I think that was a useful strategy. And for that first one, it was very much an observership rather than in a way. So I could word it in a very passive way, that I was just observing, immersing, learning.
Which I think is good to know, because I think sometimes I would think, we have to have a very set thing that I'm going for, but actually just the immersion in the places is a useful goal. Brilliant. I think we can't move on from this topic without kind of touching the admin side of things, which is arguably a tricky aspect of it. So we touched on kind of thinking about this really early. So Anna, in your fellowships, kind of writing that down 2 years in advance, and Cassandra kind of having these connections with people much earlier than you needed them. But do you have any specific advice about the admin of it all? So for example, visas, the contacting the office of the university you're going to that will receive you, because they will have their own regulations in place. And Cassandra, maybe do you want to hop on that one first?
Yeah, my main piece of advice there is just, it's going to give yourself more time than you think you need. That would be my main lesson, and I'm sharing that out of like hard-earned knowledge, because you can kind of estimate and think like, oh, surely I can't need more than 3 months, and just save yourself the stress of that and say, okay, give 6 months, and so just plan ahead as much as possible. because there will be things that come up that you're not expecting, or they might come back saying, actually, we need this extra documentation, or we need, we need, like Anna, you had said, like, we need to have emails that show why this is happening or what. And so, okay, now I've got to go track that down, talk to this person. Oh, they're on leave, or those things just happen. So extra time would be my number one.
Yeah, and it seems easier, like in theory, okay, I need to apply to a visa, but before that you need X, Y, and Z form from X, Y, Z people. So yeah, applying early, always the best call. Anna, is there anything you want to add on that?
No, I think when I went to the States, I actually had to go to the embassy and get a sticker in my passport, which felt very scary. And, so it's really security, there's super high security. So I think, it feels like really like something, what's the word, very legislative that you're doing. And, when you go through immigration, you think, I've got to say the right thing. And probably even more so now, actually, if you're going to the States. But it's the same in Australia, I have to say. You have to have... I've had to do, as I mentioned, I've got dual citizenship, having lived there, and that took a long time to get, but it's really worth it. And I went for skilled migrancy in Australia and then ended up getting citizenship, and now I can come and go to Australia as I please for the rest of my entire life, and which is just a wonderful opportunity. Because I could go and do a research visit at any time. I could entirely decamp over there. So I think it's worth the hassle, is my top tip.
Yeah, and I think even if it's just for a short visit to somewhere you've never been, I think really spending time deeply understanding the rules and the appropriate legislation that you need to follow is actually really important, because otherwise you'll just end up being quite stressed at an airport in immigration with a handful of documents. Okay, great. I think maybe we have time just for one other question. I don't see anything else in the chat, but I guess you both touched on this in terms of having family and changing your home life in relation to these visits. I think this is an amazing opportunity for travel in this career that we are in, but it can be prohibitive because of your lifestyle, of your family life, of all different aspects. And also some people, are not as keen for travel. So can you give any advice to make all of that difficulty a little bit easier on yourself and on your family or on your relationships? It's a hard question.
I think so. It's a personal perspective as well, isn't it? So I grew up. My family half my family are from Germany, Eastern Europe. Half my family are kind of English, Irish, Scottish, and they all congregated in London. And I think life is so much more exciting, interesting, and valuable if you have a diversity of cultures and experiences. And actually, I feel that you can have you have more empathy with the world. I think that I just couldn't imagine not being I just couldn't imagine feeling like there's only one way and that's the right way. I think I think it's actually, from a family perspective, especially with the kids, I want them to understand that too. So I actually feel that there's this great opportunity, like you said, to travel, and then you can bring them with you and pay that forward. But that's my very North London left-wing liberal elite attitude, and I'm sorry, we're not that. That's why I said it's a personal view as well.
Yeah, no, and I think that's important to kind of share those views, and I'm sure a lot of people will share them with you. I was just thinking as well, I think for recent conferences that I've been to, I've seen funding schemes for people who have small children if they need to bring them with them. And I can imagine that in relation to, for example, the funding I applied to for my visit, there was an option if I needed childcare to kind of apply for funding for that. And so as we become more progressive in our field, I think those opportunities will grow as well. Cassandra, did you want to touch on that one as well?
Yeah, I'll speak from just a little bit of a different personal perspective, that being so in the States, I wouldn't say that we have maybe as much openness to travel in our culture, because America's plenty big and we can visit there. And so growing up, I wouldn't have had that opportunity to travel quite as much. And so I was intimidated. And to think going from where I was raised to France would have been a huge step. But instead I went from where I was raised to the middle of America. And then after that, I went to Ireland, which is a little bit more of a stretch. And then I was able to go to France. So I would just say, if maybe you're feeling intimidated by it, just go to the edge of your comfort zone, and then it grows a little bit, and then go to the edge of that comfort zone and it'll grow a little bit. So just to think of yourself not as being static, and that this is something you can progress over time. And as you have those positive experiences, your self-efficacy grows, like, okay, I can do this, and then give it another go. And so, yeah, that's kind of been my trajectory, and who knows where I'll end up next, hopefully somewhere else really exciting. But you can just take it at your own pace as well.
I think that's excellent advice. And,
that's great.
You know, within every country, yeah, doing a research visit doesn't have to be overseas. It can be down the road. It can be a one-day visit somewhere, which I did early in my PhD. You know, I'm learning a technique, see how someone is doing it. And they do allow you to kind of develop that confidence. So I think that's really great advice. I'm going to let the final question be for Stephanie, who has a very quick question about, do we know about paying tax in the country you're visiting for a shortish visit of a few months if you're receiving salary in the UK? So I can very quickly just mention that for myself, I went on a 1-month visit to the US on a J1 visa, and I did not receive any salary in the US, and I was just continued to pay my salary in the UK. And so I just paid tax in the UK, and I didn't have to register as a tax-paying person in the US. And Anna is thumbsing up that as if that's a very similar experience. Anything else to add on that one?
Same in France when I was being paid in Ireland. So yeah.
Yeah, once you're not receiving salary from the institution you're visiting, it should be fine. And just make sure that you are maintaining salary at your home institution. And then usually you receive some funding on top of your salary that's to maintain you while you're there. So for your rent or food and things like that. Okay, I think this has been such a fun salon. I can see some typing happening, but no messages popping up. But if any more messages come up, we will each be able to see them, and we can reply in the chat function still after the live meeting has ended. And yeah, I just want to thank both our speakers, Anna and Cassandra. They were brilliant talks and really good insights, and quite different insights into how you're doing these overseas visits. And just as a very last thing, Adam, who runs Dementia Researcher, put together 10 top tips for planning these things. And I'm just going to read them out because I actually think they're quite useful. And some of them we didn't necessarily touch on. I think these may be partially AI generated, as a heads up. So the first one is do your homework on the lab's work. So where you're going, learn about who's there and who you want to visit and who you want to talk to and what you can learn from them. Number 2 is plan generously. We've really covered that, at least 6 months, because there's loads of different practicalities of this. And number 3, clarify your visit aims very early. You know, be in contact with that lab. What do you want to get out of it? Do you want to attend a conference with them while you're there? Number 4, organize, experiment, or maybe participant visiting logistics in advance. Number 5, schedule your initial inductions and mandatory trainings. I think this is really good. Get in contact with a lab manager or an administrator who knows the arrival date, and then they can kickstart your time, especially if you're really limited on only a few weeks. Engage with the whole team and treat these visits like field work. So plan for some downtime, explore the place you're visiting. That's really important and can come into the choice of where you go. And think about, you know, your lifestyle in advance, visas, housing, eSIMs, insurance. And yeah, the last point I like, learn basic language and local customs. And we've all basically talked about research visits in English-speaking countries or France where there is a high level of English. So, but I think that I like that tip to end on. Okay, thank you both, and thank you for the people who attended. And yeah, thank you for the great questions.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Cliona.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anna.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Cassandra.
Absolutely.
Bye.
Cheers, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.